Hi, it's great to be here. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about the ways in which power is and isn't really shifting in the world. And I'm going to sort of start by going a little bit back in time. I've been an activist since I was very young, and I want to talk to you a bit about how activism has changed since I was doing what I did as a kid. This was me at age 11 or 12.
Today we spoke to Jeremy Heimans at his Sydney home.
Well, I think we have got problems, and I think we have got monetary problems. What you could do is divert 10% of each nation's annual military spending to services of debt, the environment, and, health, malnutrition, children, and all these problems, because we spend an excessive amount, an enormous amount on the military, which is completely unnecessary to spend so much, and instead we've got to spend that money on immediate problems that endanger our entire society.
It's a very strange child, very, very strange. But I still agree with that. So that was my childhood. I ran around the world. I met with world leaders and Nobel Prize winners, campaigning on issues of peace and environmental justice and many other issues. And as an activist, the great weapon of my activism in the early 90s was the mighty fax machine. And so there was a particular campaign that I ran on the eve of the first Gulf War, where the US Secretary of State and the Iraqi Foreign Minister were meeting at the Intercontinental Hotel, just like this one, in Geneva. And I got on the radio and I made a bold call for everybody to flood the fax machine at the Intercontinental with faxes, urging them to speak out against the war. Now, of course, there's a little bit of a bandwidth constraint with one fax. And it limited the ability for me to reach the goals that I had. So let's now take a step 25 years forward into the future. 25 years later, there's a young woman the same age that I was called Bia. Bia's in Rio. And Bia was running a campaign to try to save her school from being demolished to make way for an Olympic parking lot. Now, as we know, a lot of development happened in Rio in the lead up to the Olympics and the World Cup that was unaccountable, that didn't involve communities, and this was one such story. Bia's school was one of the best schools in Rio. So she started a campaign on this platform that we at Purpose helped to get started called Mi Rio, and this is their tool, pressure cooker. And when we saw this campaign was getting traction, Mi Rio decided to try to turn this story into what we call in the movement building world an iconic impact story. So we created a website, we set a live stream on the school, and we invited the citizens of Rio to monitor this live stream because we knew that the demolition of the school was imminent. And as soon as people saw the bulldozers arrive, they would sign up to become text message guardians of the school. They would receive a text, and they would rush to the school to form a human barrier to protect the school. Now, this campaign caught the imagination of the citizens of Rio. Thousands of people did this, they signed up, they wanted to protect the school. And in the end, it got a huge amount of publicity in the city and sparked a debate about unaccountable Olympic development. We never needed to get people to go and form that human barrier, because all the attention it generated meant that the mayor of Rio, 72 hours after we started that campaign, had a change of heart. He decided not to close the school after all, and this, of course, is the obligatory Facebook share graphic when we won, right? Because it's very important to celebrate the victories when you do win them. So this is just a very small story, but I think it tells us something bigger than just, the mobile phone is mightier than the fax. I think that 25 years later, a young woman like Bia has at her disposal the ability to create new forms of power that I, despite my kind of incredible enthusiasm for doing so, just could never have done in the 1990s. And so I got together with a colleague who's been doing similar work in a slightly different domain, Henry Timms, who co-founded Giving Tuesday, and we started to think, how do we best describe these shifts that are happening in the world? So I want to run you through quickly a framework that does that. Old power, meet new power. So we see new power all around us, right? We see new power in the political domain. with insurgents coming with no formal political apparatus and reshaping politics. We of course see it in the economy, where these new peer-based platforms like Airbnb, not owning a single square foot of real estate, becomes the biggest player in the accommodation market globally. We see it in platforms like Patients Like Me in the health sector, where people now are disintermediating big government agencies and their doctors and doing things like crowdsourcing their own medical trials, as a group of people did recently by figuring out that lithium was an ineffective treatment for epilepsy 3 times faster than the FDA would have done. So as we think about the difference between old and new power, here's a few just conceptual differences. You could think of old power as something that's held like a currency, right? The more that you have of it, the more powerful you are, right? So your job is to hoard it. You can think of new power as something that flows like a current. You can never quite control it, right? The job is to be good at shaping it, to be good at figuring out how to influence the direction that it has. So in the article on new power that we wrote in Harvard Business Review, we sort of set out and put a little sketch together of what some of these values look like. So I just want to draw a couple of these things out. And so on the right, you've got this sort of sketch of early 21st century values. And you'll see, one, for example, there's this sort of, belief clearly in radical transparency, right? The employees at my company now are insisting that I share salary information for everyone in the company publicly, right? And that's because there's now a normative, a cultural belief that transparency is better. And you see, on the other side, the sort of the philosophy of lack of transparency, interestingly was articulated in the speech that Hillary Clinton gave to Goldman Sachs, where she said, look, there's actually a reason to have a separation between a public and a private position. Now, there actually are benefits to that, but in terms of the values of particularly millennials, that's no longer a tenable position. You also see it on people's attitudes toward affiliation, right? In the 20th century, people used to be card-carrying members of organizations, right? And they were long-term, they paid their member dues, they might be members for decades. And in the 21st century, that affiliation is much more ephemeral, right? So young people love to affiliate. They're joining many things, they're liking things, they're associating their identities with many things, but they're doing so in a much less robust way. So in the HBR piece, we sort of map this on a 2x2 matrix, because unfortunately in HBR, it's contractually obliged that every article you write has a 2x2 matrix. With the models that we're seeing emerging, so are there models that are based on mass participation and peer coordination, and the values? So a couple of quick observations. One, you think of Apple. Apple's still the most valuable company in the world, and yet it's fundamentally an old power company, right? The product designers at Cupertino figure out what's best for us. They decide that we no longer need a headphone jack, right? And the product descends upon us, we buy it. Culturally, they're not an organization that believes in transparency. They're notoriously not good at collaboration, and yet you can still have a very successful model using this approach. Now, not everyone can be Apple. You also see the contrast between the Obama campaign. Think back to 2008. It relies on this incredible surge of new power, this donor apparatus that was of small donors. You had this incredible volunteering infrastructure. Obama in office, despite having done many good things, has not necessarily been more participatory, has not fundamentally built US government in a way that is more bottom-up. So think about where your organization might live on this framework and where you want it to be in 5 years' time. So Purpose, the organization I run, builds movements that create these new power models and helps old power institutions adapt. And I want to make a couple of observations about where I think new power is being flexed in cities in a very interesting way. So Taiwan's shared regulation of Uber, to me, was fascinating, where essentially a group that had been formed, the GOV movement, outside of the formal apparatus of government, got a bunch of stakeholders together, invited real users of this service to the table, and developed a bunch of shared regulations that the government then adopted. Now, that's a really different approach to either simply doing nothing or the kind of reflexive regulatory instinct of a government. I think what's fascinating about Seoul's experiments with the sharing economy is the way in which they are thinking about how the government can play a role in actually rebuilding social capital, right? Rebuilding fraying communities in a world that's as manic and as, in some ways, sort of individualistic as ours. So what they've done is they've created an infrastructure to figure out how you can build sharing infrastructure in an apartment building, for example, where you can share books and you can share equipment. And those things are bringing people together. Because the reality is that with these new power entities like Uber and Airbnb, they're not in and of themselves actually going to bring us closer together. And that's where I think city governments can play a key role. We saw this in Paris with participatory budgeting. I think it was fascinating the way their experiment is rolled out, because it isn't just traditional participatory budgeting, sort of 70s, 80s style, where everybody has to go to the local meeting. We know that young people won't want to do that. They won't want to engage in that way. So they've built a bunch of ways for people to get involved, to vote, to participate online that reflect the different ways that people affiliate. And we did this in Delhi recently, where instead of doing a traditional kind of coalition campaign, we got rickshaw drivers to run around campaigning on climate change, which helped to drive a bunch of key policy changes in Delhi around air pollution and solar. So a couple of points on how you navigate this new power world. I think the Pope is actually a fascinating example of a new power leader. Now, if you think about what the Pope did when he first became Pope, he, instead of doing the usual thing, which is donning those red robes, he took the red robes off and he went and he actually kissed the feet of prisoners in Rome who were Muslim. The symbolism of that and everything he's done as Pope indicates a desire to push power down into the church laity and out into society. He actually launched the first ever, if you can believe it, questionnaire that was designed to go to the Catholic Church laity, actually asking them what kind of church they wanted to build. And so I think it's really interesting thinking about how you do that. Now, we see the stakes get incredibly high when you think about new power in the context of the current fight around ISIS. So the United States government's approach to fighting ISIS is literally to do airdrops. So they airdrop leaflets designed to influence civilian populations and dissuade them from being ISIS recruits. In contrast, ISIS, unfortunately, is using these highly distributed, highly effective new power tools to recruit people. So if we're going to kind of compete with those tactics, we have to do more than just airdrops, right? I was shocked to discover that when the US government thought it was stepping up its game, it actually created a Twitter handle, Think Again, Turn Away, with the seal of the United States government designed to tell potential ISIS recruits not to join ISIS. Now, if you were on the cusp of jihadism, you know, who would you listen to? And, you know, finally, I want to leave you with Aleppo and with Syria. We've been very involved in the last few years with campaigning on the Syrian crisis. And what's happening in a city that we don't think of in the same way maybe as the other cities that we've talked about. But a city that I think we all, as people, have a moral obligation to help. So we've been involved in that, and in Aleppo, there was an incredibly impactful and moving thing that happened, which was a group of volunteer rescue workers have begun to organize in Aleppo and all over Syria to save civilians. And I want to show you this video to leave you of a particular rescue that happened inside Aleppo, which I think is a really interesting example of how you use new power to change hearts and minds.
في أحد الأيام تعرضت منطقة الأنصاري لقصف بالبراميل المتفجرة. حصلنا نطالع العائلة الأولى والعائلة الثانية. العائلة الثالثة هي الأم والولد. هي فعلا يعني الأم كانت كثير منفعلة. عندها كثير كانت عصبية وكانت عم تصيح، يعني هي خايفة على حالها أو خايفة على ابنها. بعد الحفل الطويل حصلنا نسمع صوت الولد، صوت صار يبكي الولد، حصلنا نسمع صوته وكان كثير محل صعب. بعد ما وصلنا لولد هون صار الشغل كثير بده حذر، يعني هذا ولد عمره أسبوعين أو أكثر، بأي لحظة بيطب شي فوق أو بيموت أو بيختنق. هلا 12 ساعة طبعا هي ما كانت من الأرض، يعني عمل كثير حذر، يعني هي روح بدك تتعامل معها بشكل خطير جدا. يعني إنه طفل عمره أسبوعين يطب فوقه برميل أو 3 سقوف ما يسيبوا شيء، يعني وكل هالضغوطات وانه هذا الطفل يطلع اول من براميل واول من السقوف واول من كل شيء.
تبارك اسمك امه وينه؟ عدي امك المال شوي شوي خالد عليك يا خالد. الله يا الله هاتوني هو. ثواني ابوسك ثواني عيسي يا اسيا.
زرتوا الولد بعد ما انقذتوه؟
ما عندنا وقت، قولي له قصف.
And this is the young boy today. Thank you so much.